January 12, 1945. The Ardennes was a frozen nightmare. Snow stretched endlessly across the forest and fields, turning familiar landscapes into a blinding white labyrinth. For Lieutenant Frank Novak, each day brought another harsh lesson. His Shermans, the pride of American armored might, stood out like beacons against the winter canvas. 6 of his tanks had burned in 10 days, their crews lost, their metal hulks littering the ice and snow. The Germans called it survival. Novak called it slaughter. It wasn't that the Germans were superior in armor or firepower. The problem was visibility. Olive drab green was perfect for European summer forests, for the dusty roads of Normandy, but against pure white snow it was a death sentence. German tanks, painted white for winter camouflage, melted into the landscape. They appeared suddenly, close enough to fire and kill before anyone could react. Novak watched the devastation with growing frustration. Every calculation, every plan seemed doomed before it even began. Men he had trained, friends he had laughed with, disappeared in flashes of fire and smoke. Supplies, reinforcements, even terrain advantages mattered little when your position was obvious to the enemy. The U.S. Army had poured billions into these machines, turrets, engines, armor, radios, but nobody had thought about the snow. Nobody had thought about how a tank could vanish into winter like a ghost. Novak understood this immediately. He had seen German tanks glide across the white forest like spirits, striking and disappearing before he could even raise his gun, and each time he lost a Sherman. He began to make quiet calculations in his head. Invisible tanks survived. Visible tanks died. The math was cruelly simple, yet devastatingly true. He pored over sketches and maps, tracing lines through snow-covered fields, noting where ambushes had succeeded, where his men had fallen. Every time the pattern repeated. Those who blended in lived, those who didn't perished. The solution, when it came to him, was almost laughably straightforward. He didn't need more guns, more armor, or more orders. He needed camouflage, pure and simple. He needed to paint his Shermans white. There was no time for bureaucracy. The army would never authorize it, not in time to save his men. Novak began to plan in silence. The audacity of what he was about to do weighed on him, yet it carried the promise of survival. Every choice, every risk now had the potential to save lives. He imagined his platoon, 15 tanks, slipping across snowfields unseen, turning the deadly tables on their hunters. Each tank a predator, invisible until it struck. And so, beneath the moonlit snow, Novak's mind raced. He traced the contours of enemy supply depots, imagined the paint, the brushes, the transformation of his green death traps into white phantoms. The forest whispered around him, wind slicing through the trees, carrying the scent of smoke and oil from the day's battles. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired, a grim reminder that hesitation meant death. Novak clenched his jaw. He would not wait for permission. He would not wait for paperwork. Every delay could mean another Sherman, another man, gone. The stakes were stark and unyielding. Invisibility was the difference between life and death. And if that meant stealing 40 gallons of enemy paint under the cover of night, then Novak knew the risk was worth it. The cold bit at his fingers, and frost crept into his boots, but his mind was on fire with determination. Each calculation, each memory of lost comrades, each burning tank he had watched slide into ruin fueled his resolve. This winter, he would fight not just with guns and shells, but with cleverness, with audacity, with the simple, undeniable mathematics of survival. The snow would no longer be his enemy, it would be his ally, and the green tanks, once so conspicuous, would vanish into white, silent, deadly, ready to strike where the Germans least expected. The morning after another burned Sherman, Lieutenant Frank Novak stood over the frozen remains, the smell of scorched metal still clinging to the air. He counted the losses again, his mind tracing the pattern he had begun to notice. Every destroyed tank told the same story. Every crater, every twisted turret, every blackened hull was a testament to the same fatal flaw: visibility. He pulled out a worn map and spread it across the snow-crusted table in the command tent. He began to mark each engagement, each kill, each loss. Green tanks against white fields, German tanks painted white against the same. The pattern was undeniable. He ran numbers in his head, mentally comparing the survival rates. Shermans stuck out like beacons, making targeting almost effortless for German gunners. The enemy's white Panzer IVs and Tigers disappeared into the forest and snow, emerging only to fire, then melting away as if by magic. Survival, Novak realized, wasn't a matter of skill or bravery alone. It was about being unseen. He imagined the probabilities, the cold, hard statistics. A tank visible in the open had a 75% chance of being hit at 1,000 meters. A camouflage tank might survive multiple engagements. Numbers didn't lie. Invisible tanks lived. Visible tanks died. His men were skilled, disciplined, and brave, but even courage could not compensate for being easy targets. He saw the frustration in their eyes, the anger and helplessness. These were not failures of strategy, not failures of leadership. They were failures of design and preparation. The Army had invested billions in armor, guns, engines, radios, and logistics, but had overlooked the simple factor of color in winter combat. Novak felt a surge of disbelief mixed with urgency. How could no one have foreseen this? How could snow, so constant and predictable, have been ignored in the plans, the manuals, the doctrine? Each moment he delayed, more men would die. He began to consider solutions, thinking in both practical and daring terms. Paint. The solution was almost absurd in its simplicity, yet elegant and deadly effective. If green made them targets, white would make them ghosts. Camouflage wasn't new, but applying it to tanks in the middle of a brutal winter, without permission, without precedent, was radical. Novak imagined the calculations he could run, the probabilities he could improve, the lives he could save. He imagined 15 tanks slipping across frozen fields unseen, each one a silent hunter, each one a potential savior of the men inside. And yet the risk was enormous. Unauthorized action in the Army could mean courts-martial, dishonor, even prison. He considered the cost, weighed it against the lives already lost, and felt no hesitation. He could not watch another Sherman burn while the solution was so obvious. The more he analyzed, the more methodical his plan became. He began listing what he would need: paint, brushes, hours of labor, secrecy, and a precise timing window to avoid patrols and enemy observation. He visualized the process, mentally walking through the depot, the tanks, the cold, the brushes spreading white across green metal, transforming them from conspicuous targets into visible predators. Novak thought about his men, their fear, their weariness, their hope. He realized that survival was not just technical, it was psychological. The moment they saw their tanks vanish into the snow, they would fight with renewed confidence. The enemy, expecting easy targets, would meet ghosts. His mind raced with calculations, sketches, and contingencies. Every possible complication had to be anticipated: frozen paint, patrols, timing, noise, even the possibility of discovery. Yet in each scenario he saw the same solution. Camouflage was the key. Numbers, probability, survival, it all pointed to the same audacious action. Novak could not wait for orders. Orders might never come. The Army was too slow, too bureaucratic, too rigid to adapt to the immediate crisis. And so he began to prepare, mentally, emotionally, strategically. He was not just a tank commander now. He was a problem solver, a tactician, a man who would bend rules to save lives. In the cold, silent tent, he traced paths across the map again, marking where his white-painted tanks could appear, where they could strike, where they could survive. Each mark was a potential saved life, a chance to turn the tide, a defiance of the very system that had left them exposed. The snow outside glistened under the pale winter sun, blinding and cruel, yet Novak saw not an enemy, but an opportunity. The battlefield was a canvas, and he would paint survival on it, even if it meant risking everything himself. He understood fully that this was not just innovation, it was necessity. The math was clear, the odds were clear, the consequences of inaction were clear. And in that clarity, Novak resolved that no regulation, no chain of command, no form or approval would stand between his men and the chance to survive another day. Night fell over the Ardennes like a velvet curtain, thick and suffocating. Lieutenant Frank Novak moved quietly among his men, checking positions, whispering orders, and keeping watch. The moon cast pale reflections on the snow, turning the forest into a silver maze. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a possible threat. He had made his decision. The army would not authorize white paint in time, and waiting meant more of his tanks, more of his men would burn. The risk was enormous. If caught, he could be court-martialed. If discovered by the Germans, death was immediate. Yet Novak's resolve did not waver. He had calculated the odds, and inaction was far more deadly than any punishment. He studied the map of the captured German supply depot. The location was known, lightly guarded, and filled with the very paint that could save lives. The depot had been taken weeks before, left mostly untouched. He had observed patrol patterns, enemy routines, and weak points. Every detail mattered. Timing was everything. At precisely 2100 hours, the darkness thickened, and Novak gave the signal. The small strike team moved like shadows through the snow, boots silent, weapons ready, eyes sharp. The forest was eerily still, as if holding its breath. Adrenaline pulsed through every man. One misstep, one crack of ice, and the night could end in fire and capture. They reached the depot's perimeter, a simple wire fence and a few sentries, more complacent than cautious. Novak gestured, and the team slipped past silently, crawling low in the snow, each breath visible in the cold night air. Inside, the depot was a treasure trove, crates stacked high, barrels of white paint, brushes and supplies meant for the Wehrmacht. Novak's heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. 40 gallons of enemy paint waited. It was absurd, almost comical, to see American soldiers preparing to steal supplies from the very men they had been fighting. But absurdity gave way to necessity. They worked quickly, lifting barrels, securing them with ropes, careful not to spill a drop. The cold bit into their hands, frost forming on brushes and barrels, yet they moved with precision, every man knowing that speed and silence were their shields. Novak paused, scanning the depot for movement, listening to the distant howls of artillery, the echoes of gunfire that had haunted his days. Each moment was charged with tension. Every second spent in the depot was a second closer to discovery. Yet he could not stop. Survival demanded audacity. With the barrels secured, they began their careful trek back, hauling the stolen paint through snow-laden paths, across frozen streams, and beneath trees heavy with frost. Shadows seemed to dance around them, imagined eyes in the darkness, the fear of being caught gnawing at the edges of courage. Novak led the way, every instinct sharpened. He knew the terrain, the enemy, and his men. Every decision had to be flawless. A stumble, a slip, a sound, any mistake could end the night in disaster. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. In the cold and darkness, time was fluid. Finally, they reached the perimeter of their own camp, the stolen barrels intact, their prize secured. Novak allowed himself the briefest flicker of triumph, but there was no time to linger. The real work lay ahead, transforming their green Shermans into invisible hunters. He looked at the paint, at the cold white liquid that promised life, that promised survival. Each gallon represented not just a tank, but a man saved from a fiery death in the snow. He felt the weight of responsibility, the thrill of daring, and the quiet exhilaration of bending the rules for the greater good. As the first light of dawn crept across the frozen forest, Novak and his men prepared for the next step. They had stolen the means, but victory would depend on their ability to use it, to turn ordinary tanks into ghosts that could slip across the battlefield unseen. The night had been a success, a delicate balance of risk, courage, and calculation. Yet Novak knew the true challenge awaited in the hours to come, painting the Shermans, transforming them, and seeing his plan come alive under the harsh winter sky. Every brushstroke would carry the weight of lives, each coat of paint a shield against death. And so, with barrels of stolen white paint at his side, Novak prepared to defy convention, to rewrite the rules of survival in a winter of fire, snow, and war.
Dawn broke over the Ardennes, casting pale light across frozen fields and frost-laden trees. Lieutenant Frank Novak stood before his platoon's 15 Shermans, green and conspicuous against the white winter landscape. The barrels of stolen German paint were lined up, brushes ready, and men huddled in the biting cold, anticipation and exhaustion etched into their faces. Novak knew that this was the moment that could save lives or cost them. He took a deep breath and gave the silent command, "Begin." The soldiers worked methodically, each brushstroke a careful application, each coat covering the familiar olive drab with the stark, bright white that would render their tanks nearly invisible in the snow. Frost bit at their fingers, and the cold seeped through gloves and coats, but no man paused. Every stroke was calculated, precise, and deliberate. Novak moved among them, inspecting the work, offering guidance, ensuring that no patch remained green. The transformation was extraordinary. By midday, 15 death traps, once obvious targets for German gunners, had become phantoms, blending seamlessly with the snow and ice. Novak allowed himself a brief moment to appreciate the scene, the sunlight glinting off the fresh white paint, the hulks of steel no longer glaringly visible, the potential to strike without warning. But there was no time for celebration. Theory had to meet reality. The first test came quickly as German reconnaissance moved across the snowy hills. Novak positioned his newly white-painted Shermans along likely approaches, using the terrain to their advantage: ridges, tree lines, frozen streams, and shallow depressions. He held his breath, waiting, calculating. And then they appeared, enemy Panzer IVs and Tigers patrolling as if the battlefield were empty. At first, the Germans did not see the white Shermans. Novak's tanks remained unseen, like ghosts sliding across the snow. And then, at the perfect moment, Novak gave the order. The white Shermans emerged from concealment and opened fire. The impact was immediate and devastating. German tanks, expecting only visible targets, were caught off guard. Shots struck with precision, crews panicked, and within minutes, the advantage had shifted. Novak watched, a mixture of relief and awe coursing through him. His calculations had worked. The invisible tanks were now predators, not prey. The men in the platoon reacted with exhilaration, confidence replacing fear. They had survived the night of planning, the audacious raid, and now they were reaping the reward of daring ingenuity. Novak made mental notes for further improvement: angles, positioning, timing of attacks, ways to enhance concealment further. Every detail mattered.
Each engagement added to the proof that white camouflage was not just effective, it was life-saving. Word began to spread through the battalion. Crews who had doubted the plan now whispered in admiration. Commanders who had overlooked winter camouflage were confronted with undeniable results. This simple act, this theft of paint and audacious repainting, had transformed 15 vulnerable tanks into instruments of stealth and survival. Novak felt a quiet pride, tempered by the memory of those still lost in the snowy forest. Every life saved now carried the weight of lives already taken, and the responsibility of using this new advantage wisely rested on his shoulders. He continued to refine deployment strategies, testing each position against sight lines, snowdrifts, and terrain contours. The German soldiers, unprepared for this innovation, continued to underestimate the white Shermans, offering Novak further proof that initiative in the field could rewrite doctrine. By evening, Novak walked along the line of tanks, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across snow and steel. The transformation was complete. 15 tanks, once glaringly obvious, now merged with the winter landscape, ready to strike, survive, and protect the men inside. Novak knew that the experiment had succeeded, and yet he also knew that this was only the beginning. Winter camouflage, once unauthorized and daring, would become a standard of survival. Every brushstroke, every stolen barrel of paint had proven the value of bold, immediate action. As darkness returned to the Ardennes, Novak allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope, not just for his men, but for the principle that in war, cleverness, courage, and audacity could turn the tide against even the deadliest of circumstances. He had painted not just tanks, but a path to survival. The snow was no longer a threat, it was an ally. And with that realization, Novak prepared for the battles still to come, knowing that the white Shermans would haunt the German forces like ghosts they could not see until it was too late.
The white-painted Shermans had proven their worth in battle, but the story was far from over. Lieutenant Frank Novak watched his platoon maneuver across the snow, each tank a ghost among the frozen trees, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine the consequences of their audacity. These tanks, once glaring targets, now slipped through enemy lines, striking with precision and vanishing before retaliation could reach them. Reports began to filter back from other units, whispers of miraculous survival and unexpected victories in the Ardennes. Novak knew that what had begun as a desperate, unauthorized experiment was changing the way men thought about winter combat. His actions, once a gamble with potential court-martial hanging over him, had shifted the balance of life and death for the men under his command. Yet even with success, the weight of responsibility remained heavy. He could not forget the tanks that had burned, the men who had died, the friends lost to snow and fire. Each victory was tempered with memory, each triumph shadowed by the cost of delay and oversight. The army, initially unaware of Novak's improvisation, began to take notice. Reports described the strange phenomenon of invisible Shermans striking with deadly effect, and higher commands asked questions. Novak maintained discretion, careful not to attract unwanted attention, but word spread nonetheless. Eventually, the undeniable proof of effectiveness could not be ignored. After the battle, studies were conducted, analyzing the advantages of winter camouflage. The math Novak had calculated in his tent, visible tanks died, invisible tanks survived, was now confirmed on the battlefield. Within a few years, lessons from the Ardennes were codified into doctrine. By the Korean War, winter camouflage was officially recognized, standardized, and taught in armored divisions. Novak's audacious theft of 40 gallons of enemy paint had become a cornerstone of military innovation, a simple, practical solution that had saved countless lives and reshaped tactical thinking. Historians later noted that the Ardennes campaign had revealed weaknesses not just in armor or firepower, but in adaptability and imagination.
Novak's initiative demonstrated that even in rigid hierarchies, individual courage and intelligence could alter outcomes dramatically. His white Shermans became more than machines. They were symbols of resourcefulness, proof that survival often depended on seeing problems differently and acting decisively. The legacy of that winter extended far beyond the snowy forests of Belgium. It influenced training, doctrine, and the very philosophy of armored warfare. Future commanders learned to adapt camouflage, to anticipate environmental hazards, and to empower soldiers to take initiative when standard procedures failed. Novak himself was quietly celebrated, though he remained humble, knowing that the lives saved were the true measure of success. Veterans from his platoon recounted the stories with reverence, how their tanks had vanished into the snow, how they had emerged from ambushes alive when others had fallen, how one man's daring had rewritten the rules of survival. The psychological impact was as profound as the tactical advantage. Soldiers gained confidence, knowing that cleverness could outweigh brute force, that audacity could counter predictability. And in the quiet moments, when Novak walked along the line of white tanks, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events: a frozen battlefield, a brutal winter, the deaths of comrades, and a decision to act without orders. The stolen paint had become a lifeline, a symbol of ingenuity, and a testament to the power of initiative. As the snow settled each winter over future training grounds and battlefields, the story of Novak's white Shermans endured. It reminded commanders and soldiers alike that innovation often emerges not from manuals, but from necessity. That survival sometimes requires bending rules, thinking creatively, and daring to act when others hesitate. And in the quiet moments, when Novak walked along the line of white tanks, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events: a frozen battlefield, a brutal winter, the deaths of comrades, and a decision to act without orders. The stolen paint had become a lifeline, a symbol of ingenuity, and a testament to the power of initiative. As the snow settled each winter over future training grounds and battlefields, the story of Novak's white Shermans endured. It reminded commanders and soldiers alike that innovation often emerges not from manuals, but from necessity. That survival sometimes requires bending rules, thinking creatively, and daring to act when others hesitate. And in the quiet moments, when Novak walked along the line of white tanks, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events: a frozen battlefield, a brutal winter, the deaths of comrades, and a decision to act without orders. The stolen paint had become a lifeline, a symbol of ingenuity, and a testament to the power of initiative.
As the snow settled each winter over future training grounds and battlefields, the story of Novak's white Shermans endured. It reminded commanders and soldiers alike that innovation often emerges not from manuals, but from necessity. That survival sometimes requires bending rules, thinking creatively, and daring to act when others hesitate. And while the cold Ardennes winters claimed many, Novak's courage and insight saved more than it cost, leaving a legacy that would shape armored warfare for generations. In the end, the lesson was clear: war is unforgiving, but human ingenuity can tip the scales. A barrel of paint, a bold plan, and the courage to act became a story of survival, adaptation, and triumph, proving that even in the darkest winter, one determined individual could change the course of history.